This is the first video screenshot for weeks 5 to 6, and in it we're going to finish off the chapter on consideration. And we really have two concepts that are distinct that we want to consider, and that is the topic of past consideration. And then we will also take a look at something known as the pre-existing legal duty rule. And as I point out at the beginning, I think it would be useful for you to make reference to the definition of consideration that I put in the previous posting, a working definition of consideration. And that is, we've got a promise, and is there legally sufficient consideration to support the promise? And that's going to depend upon if in exchange for the promise someone agreed to perform an act they were not otherwise legally required to perform, or, as in the case of Hammer versus Sidway, refrain from performing an act that they otherwise had a legal right to perform. When we look at past consideration, we're really focusing on that part of the working definition that is encapsulated, I know I could say that, in the language "in exchange for the promise." Let me give you an example that I don't have in the posting. I have a terrific assistant. Don't tell her that. No, she knows that because I tell her that all the time. And we have had, I don't know, this is about the middle, near the end of February. We've had, since the first of the year, an awful lot of traffic, legal work that we've been pumping out. And I couldn't have done it without her great assistance. And I pay her for it, of course. But let's assume, this is a hypothetical, let's assume that Monday morning, when we sit down and talk, it's Saturday afternoon right now, when we sit down to talk about our plans for the week, I say to her, by the way, we've already hit what I wanted to get done in February, and we still have a week to go. So I want to give you a bonus for the terrific work you've been doing for me. So, call up the payroll company and tell them to put, I'm just going to make this up, $200 more in your next paycheck. And she goes, oh, that's great. That's very gracious of you. So now the question becomes, is there legally sufficient consideration to support my promise to give her a $200 bonus in her paycheck? And my answer is no, there's not legally sufficient consideration. And the reason is she gave me nothing in exchange for the promise. What I did is made a promise based on something that had already happened. And that's what past consideration is all about. Obviously, most of us would agree, including me, that it would be really bad or immoral, if you want to use that expression, for me to make that promise and then not keep it. But that's our value system, that we'd like to think that if we make a sincere promise to someone, we keep it. But that's not in line with what we're talking about here under the concept of past consideration. There's an example on the book. It's a simple example, page 47 of the book, but it helps us with just a basic understanding of past consideration. So Fred's son Daniel was taken in by an elderly couple. That's from The Problem. I don't know if they're younger than me or older than me. As he was returning home during a snowstorm, and when he finally got home, he told his father, Fred, what they had done for him, and Fred was so grateful that he wrote them a letter in which he promised to pay them $500, and they, the elderly couple, accepted Fred's promise. Then Fred and Daniel had some kind of a falling out, and Fred did not follow through on his promise to the couple. And the question becomes whether his promise to the couple, Fred's promise, was supported by legally sufficient consideration. And the answer is no, it wasn't, because the couple didn't give Fred anything in exchange for the promise. His promise was predicated only on conduct that had already been performed before he made the promise, just as in my example with my terrific legal assistant. So there are some examples. There's an example in the book, and it's kind of messy because there's other things going on, and I don't think it's worth our time, given the topics we have to cover, to unravel it all. It's the Allen Iverson case. Iverson was just such a terrific basketball player in his time. But basically what happens is somebody who was hovering around him, as they do often for young athletes, came up with a logo or a meme or whatever you want to call it, that Iverson should refer to himself as the answer. And then after, and it wasn't done in exchange for anything. The guy just, because I think he was trying to get inside for a greater reward. And then after that, Iverson made a promise, but the promise Iverson made was like my promise in my hypothetical to my assistant, Kathy, and like Fred's promise to the elderly couple. Nothing was given in exchange for the promise. It was based on conduct that had already occurred. But that's a look at past consideration. Now we have something known as the pre-existing legal duty rule. And again, let's keep in mind that we're looking at the working definition of consideration. And here something is given in exchange for a promise. But when we look closely at what was given in exchange for the promise, we'll see that the person who was doing something in exchange for the promise was doing something that they already had a legal duty to perform, or were agreeing to perform an act they already had a legal duty to perform. And let me give you an example not in the posting, and it's based on a real case coming out of Atlantic City, I don't know, in the 1920s, probably at the time of Boardwalk Empire, if you were a fan of that show. In any event, you have a wealthy widow, the Widow Gray. And as they like to say, her jewelry had gone missing. And the Widow Gray offered a reward. What happens is a detective for the Atlantic City Police, I think his name was Martino, finds the jewelry and brings it back to the Widow Gray. And I'm sure she thanked him very much, but Martino wanted his reward. And I suspect at that time the Widow Gray turns to her lawyer, because, you know, wealthy people always have a lawyer around, to hold on to their money, and she refuses to pay the reward, and Martino sues her for the reward. And the question becomes, was there legally sufficient consideration provided by Martino in exchange for the Widow Gray's promise to pay a reward? And the answer is no, there wasn't, because his job, Martino's job as a detective, was to go out and find the jewelry and return it. And so in exchange for the promise, he did nothing other than what he was already under a legal duty to perform. In page 47 in the book, there's a problem which is very basic. You've got Burstein, and she owned some land. She wanted to have a structure built, and she put it out for bid. And Shade agrees to, perform the construction, to build the structure for a certain price. And after there was that agreement and Shade began to perform the contract, he goes to Bernstein and he wants extra money because of inflation and a recent price hike in materials. And she reluctantly agrees to pay the additional sum, but then later, maybe she went to the same lawyer as the widow Gray, she changes her mind and refused to pay the additional sum. And the question becomes whether there is legally sufficient consideration to support her promise to pay the additional sum, and the answer is no, because under the original agreement, Shade had agreed to construct this structure for an agreed-upon price. And in exchange for her promise to pay more money, he only promised to perform an act that he was already legally required to perform. And if you will, he had a pre-existing legal duty to build the house for the original contract price. And what we would say is by agreeing to construct at that price, he took on the risk of a increase in the cost of materials. Now, in his contract, he could have had an escalator clause. If the price of materials went up, then she would be liable for more money, but he didn't have that kind of clause in his contract. There is an exception to the pre-existing legal duty rule, and the authors do a nice job with it, I think, and it's called the unforeseen difficulties. And so what happens here is that after the agreement is reached, in performing the contract, one of the parties runs into substantial and reasonably unforeseeable difficulties. Under those circumstances, a promise to pay additional money is going to be supported by legally sufficient consideration. And there's a problem on page 48 of the book that does a nice job of showing how the unforeseen difficulties comes into play. But let me end the pre-existing legal duty rule with a situation I once encountered. It's not very exciting, but I think it fits nicely into this. So I had this house once, and what had happened was over the decades, people had painted over the natural woodwork because that was the style back then. And I had a dining room with wainscoting, etc., and all of it had been painted. So I wanted to get it down to the original wood. I realized I didn't have the time to put in the effort, perhaps not the skill either to do it. So I hired a guy to do it, and he came in and he looked at the job, and we talked about it, and he agreed to perform the work of removing the paint. There was about 6 coatings of paint from the woodwork. After he started performing it, I remember my spouse at the time called me up and said, "You better come home. He's upset. It's taken him a lot longer to complete the job than he thought, and I'm certain he believes he's losing money." I went home and I agreed to pay the guy more money because I felt it was fair, and I kept my word. But actually, if I had not come across with the second promise, I think I could have stuck him with a pre-existing legal duty rule that he was already under a legal duty under our original agreement to remove the paint for a certain price, and that I would have been like Burstein. All he gave me in exchange for my second promise was something he was already legally required to do. And again, I didn't do that. My guess is you wouldn't either. But I think that just illustrates how we can view the pre-existing legal duty rule by way of examples. That'll end this video.